Welcome to the Inside Story. I'm Billy Hollowell, and today's show is going to be a little bit different. We're going to be reflecting on a trip that Samantha Kamman of the Christian Post took to Israel. This is a very, very interesting trip and experience that she had there, and we're going to get into the ins and the outs of what she saw, what she experienced. Samantha, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thank you. It's so good to be able to talk with you again.
So you took this trip, and this was your second time in Israel. Obviously, the first time you went was before this October 7th attack. This trip that you just took at the end of May into June, coming after really one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult times in modern Israel that we have seen, the most deadly attack on Israel, on the Jewish people since the Holocaust, with what happened with Hamas's attack on October 7th. Let's just start with what was the most surprising thing to you that you saw or experienced during this trip?
So, a couple things surprised me. So, yes, I last traveled to Israel with Passages, which brings Christians to Israel. That was in December 2019, and we spent a little bit of time there still in January 2020. What surprised me was this current trip, how empty the holy sites we went to were. Like, I remember last time it was so packed. You were elbow to elbow with each other. Tour guides are telling each other, like, hey, like, come in, like, tapping each other on the shoulder, just be like, hey, you're kind of disrupting my tour. Like, could we spread out a little bit, or could you keep your voice down a little? Here, we went to the place where Jesus is believed to have delivered his sermon on the Mount of Beatitudes, and we were like the only people there.
Oh,
The
wow.
other, yeah, and it fits with the Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics. Tourist entries went from there like around 68,000 people in February, and then in March, Israel had about over 79,000 people. Last year, around the same time frame, they had over 300,000 tourist entries. So this is why Ministry of Tourism brought reporters like me out there. They want us out there telling stories about the holy sites to hopefully revive tourism there.
So it
Something
is decimated. It is decimated tourism, essentially, what happened October 7th.
people are afraid to go there.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you have any of those fears? Obviously, you had been there before. Going back in light of what had just happened a few months back.
I didn't. I felt surprisingly calm, I guess because I knew Ministry of Tourism would not be inviting reporters out there if they knew it was going to be dangerous. And something that they told us, this was their perspective, they just said that, yeah, most of the danger is going to be closer to Gaza, or if you go to the north, closer to Lebanon.
So, that is really interesting about the tourism numbers and unfortunate. And obviously, they're trying to, shift that back into the direction where it was before. Pretty crazy to go from 300,000 down to, 79,000,
Yeah.
69,000. Um, what was the most moving thing? Because there's a difference between being surprised by your encounters and then being moved that maybe you witnessed while you were there.
Mhm. So Israel has not forgotten the hostages and the tragedy of October 7th. Right after I got off the plane at Ben Gurion Airport, I could just see photos of the hostages just lined up to greet me. And they're still even going the opposite direction. If you're leaving Israel, they're all lined up. So you see it and remember. And this woman was waiting for me when I got off the plane. She had a sign saying, Samantha Kamman, welcome. And we were walking by the photos of the hostages, and her name was O, and we were having a nice conversation as we were walking. And then I asked her, I'm like, okay, can I ask you something personal? Do you know any of these people? And she brought me over to the photo of this young man. And she said, yeah, we lived in the same community together. He was like a brother to me. I know his parents. And we walked forward a little bit. And she pointed to another young man and she said, when I did my mandatory military service, I served with him. I know him as well. So it was just so moving to see how connected everyone is. And then you go to Tel Aviv, which is a city in Israel that's very, very liberal. It's almost like it's almost like California. I mean, but it's much more unique than California. But people are walking around, in their swimwear, and it's not as religious as Jerusalem. But at one point, I was walking through with my guide, Sharon, and we came across this fountain. And you just see it's completely decked out with photos of the hostages, teddy bears, Israeli flags. And my guide, Sharon, who we had been having such a nice conversation as we were walking around Tel Aviv, she was smiling, joking with me. She just began to cry. And I said, like, oh, are you all right? I'm so sorry. And she's just like, no, no, it's the soldiers. And she's like, that's what I'm crying over. And just everything, the hostages. And she's just like, It's just been such a long time since I've come by this fountain." And she urged me to take pictures of it.
It's I want to just so people understand this because in talking with people, obviously in America, we think back to 9/11 being our biggest terror attack, the most horrific thing. And you look at those numbers and they were big numbers. What happened was horrific. But if you were to translate the October 7th attack numbers wise based on population, it would be like somebody coming into America and killing 40,000 people, right? I mean, when you look at the proportion of people in America versus Israel, that Israel's a small country. So when you talk about people knowing, that person meeting you there, knowing people who had been killed or impacted, yeah, I mean, it's a small population, a lot of people, and just when I heard that figure, if this had happened in America, it would be comparable to 40,000. I was just blown away by that because it's monumental. And that kind of brings me to this question of how are people's lives different in Israel, after the attacks when compared to before?
Mhm. There is this sense of loss, and but the Israelis seem like they're still trying to remain hopeful. My tour guide Sharon, I'm paraphrasing something that she told me, but she said, "Oh, Israelis still try to find ways to smile and laugh through tears." And she told me how a lot of people have changed their views about their country's security, but people don't want to leave because many came to Israel because they experienced anti Semitism in other countries. So there's this sense of, well, where would we go? But just again, to your point about how, yeah, it is a small country and people are so connected, so impacted by what happened. Many are still invested in the stories of these hostages. They have not forgotten what everyone went through on October 7th. And during an interview I did with my guide after the tour, she said how people were literally like coming out of their homes and dancing and laughing and crying after they heard the news about the IDF's recent rescue of 4 hostages. So again, they're just so invested in what's happening to everyone in after this tragedy, and they're really just trying to support one another.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting to watch a country come together. Again, in our country, I think 9/11, when you think about life after 9/11, people coming together for that period of time after. What was the biggest lesson that you learned from survivors as you interacted, as you traveled through Israel and had a chance to talk with them? What did you learn?
I've learned that despite the danger, despite the security risks, people want to continue living in Israel. The country's so unique in that regard. Like when you think of what happened with a place like Ukraine, people are like, okay, let's relocate, let's live elsewhere. But for Israelis, this is their home. They want to return despite what happened.
Yeah. Well, and of course, I mean, and they should be able to. Nobody should be have to live in fear that people are going to wipe them out, right? I mean, and this is a whole other podcast conversation, but the idea that these people would not be allowed to go home, that they would have to live in fear forever. This has been the story of the Jewish people again and again and again, and it's unacceptable in every era, particularly in this era. But when you talked with people and you observe, what was your sense of Israelis' views on this current war in Gaza, which, stretches on nearly, we're not quite at a year. October will be a year, but we're inching towards that year mark, and this war is still going.
So before October 7th, this is what my guide Sharon told me. So many Israelis believed it'd be possible to make peace with Gazans. You had people driving ambulances there, trying to deliver food, take part in outreach programs to try and build bridges. She herself even said for the longest time, I thought maybe Israel could scale back on its military budget, just rely on technology. After October 7th, many now want to see Hamas eradicated. And one of the things she told me is those people who were driving ambulances to Gaza or doing aid are some of the people who were targeted then on October 7th. And there's this other feeling that many Israelis have. It's that their government failed to protect them and the loved ones that were then taken hostage. And they want to see a focus on recovering them. Actually, while I was there, I actually saw a protest one day outside Netanyahu's house of people demanding the hostages returned because some feel that the Israeli government has forgotten about the victims and they want to see more of a push to make a deal and bring their loved ones home.
Yeah, and I think that the hostages in this have really been the centerpiece because again and again, I think this war obviously could have ended a long time ago. And maybe that's oversimplifying, but it would certainly not be going to this level had the hostages been returned. This refusal by Hamas to return the hostages and to continue holding people is just horrific, and it has been the gasoline on the fire of this war the entire time. And so it has been interesting to watch a country truly stand by its people and to say we are not going to stop until we have them back. That's not something you see very often. Of course, neither was the attack and the circumstance that sparked all of this, but it is notable in this. Are there any other big moments that you want to share? Obviously, you saw and heard and experienced so much during this trip.
Just that experience of driving up to Jerusalem. We finally arrived there, and my leaders on the trip decided to make it special. They were blasting music. It's just such a beautiful city, and people of Israel have survived so much. And that first night there, we went to this light show at the Tower of David in Jerusalem, where it goes through the history of Israel and all that the Jews have endured from, destruction of the Second Temple, the Romans expelling them, and at the end, this message in lights just urges people to pray for peace in Jerusalem. So that was something that was just so impactful.
Absolutely, absolutely. And just as you reflect on the trip as a whole and you look back at what you saw and experienced, what did you personally learn? What changed you about this experience?
I feel like I have a better understanding of Israelis, how they live, how they cope through tragedies like October 7th, and being able to go there during this time, I got to see firsthand how this is a country that it grieves together and it tries to support one another.
Absolutely. Well, Samantha, I appreciate you joining us to share this, an incredible experience that you had. And of course, you've been writing about this over at the Christian Post. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
Everyone else, make sure, as always, you tune in next week for another episode of The Inside Story. Subscribe, rate the show on your favorite podcast platforms, and we'll see you again next week.